Hi, Year 13. This lecture is looking at sociology and the possible influence sociology might have on social policy. So the first question you might want to answer is, what exactly is social policy? Social policy generally deals with social problems. Now, these are problems or behaviour that causes public concern. Okay, so a social problem is a problem that causes public concern, which is different to a sociological problem. For example, sociologists will look for patterns of behaviour, and that would be a sociological problem. What's interesting is that for a sociologist, they might even see normal behaviour as being a sociological problem, as they'd be interested in why do some people choose not to commit crime when others do. So they'd be interested in both sides of the behaviour. This question actually comes up quite often in the exam. Should and can sociologists influence social policy? And we're going to also be looking at how the different perspectives view sociology and the role of social policy in our society. So, social policy is the actions of governments that have a direct impact on the welfare of the citizens by providing them with services or income. So what areas of social life might these be? Well, social security, such as benefits, education, health, like free healthcare, transport, housing, law and order, defence, crime as well. So criminal policies as well will be included in that section. And how do you think sociologists can actually influence social policy? What's the main way sociologists can influence social policy? This is Dick Hobbs, who we've looked at before. He has done plenty of research into the effects of binge drinking, for example. He is sponsored by the Economic and Social Research Council, looking at female door staff in the nighttime economy. And he also has sponsorship from the European Economic Community, looking at organised crime. And he quite famously said, "I can honestly say that my research hasn't made a blind bit of difference to any government policies, even though he is actually sponsored by government agencies, whether they be national or European government agencies." And I wonder why that might be. So how is it that sociology can influence policies? Well, firstly, they can inform policymakers of different viewpoints other than their own. Now, policymakers are politicians. They can also assess the effectiveness of existing policies, so possibly examine the impact of, the bedroom tax, or examine the impact of the introduction of free schools, and assess how effective these policies have been in reducing inequality or getting people off benefits, for example. It can also help people to understand the issue better, like, for example, poverty, by providing evidence about it. And it can also reveal the unintended consequences of the policies. Now, I'd like you to have a quick look at the attached document that I've sent on the email with this lecture, called The Effects of Social Policies. And it gives you a range of policies that were introduced that had unintended consequences. So what factors influence how much effect the research might have on social policy? So it depends really how closely aligned the ideology of the government is with the research and the findings that you suggest. So, Dick Hobbs speaking here, he advised that 24-hour pub opening would not solve Britain's alcohol problems, and everyone he spoke to agreed with him, but they went ahead anyway. And he thinks it's for economic reasons. We are so reliant now on pubs and clubs and city centres that you've taken them away what's going to be there. Now, I remember we spoke about how many billions it was worth a year, the nighttime economy. And if you remember, we looked at the moral panic around binge drinkers with this problem, where the media demonised young drinkers as being the problem and not alcohol as being the problem. The 1980 Black Report into Class Inequalities in Health made a range of recommendations on how to reduce these inequalities, and the findings were ignored as they did not fit in with the Conservative government's agenda. So there are a few different ways in which sociologists can influence policy. One way is through pressure groups. Okay, so pressure groups are formed to specifically apply pressure to MPs and people who make policy. Some are much more some are much more powerful than others. So you have insider pressure groups who are invited to committee meetings, who are asked for advice, and you have outsider pressure groups. Now, insider groups might be things like energy firms, they might be perceived experts on educational policy, they might be the business community, whereas outsider pressure groups are much more likely to be like environmental groups, groups that are on the fringes of society, representing some of the less powerful causes in our society. Electoral popularity is quite a good way for research findings. Will have an influence whether research findings are used or not. If the research proposes a policy that will be popular, okay, with the voters, they're much more likely to use that policy. However, the other side of it, if it would be unpopular, so for example, we should increase benefits to get rid of poverty, that would not fly with the voters, so they do not implement those sorts of policies. Cost and funding has a big implication. The cost of certain policies may make them not viable, so there might not be enough funding, for example, to roll out increases in benefits or make or build more social housing, so we get rid of the housing crisis. Finally, what actually counts as a problem at a particular time and what solution is acceptable will have an influence on whether the research findings are used. So the perceived problem of single mothers may be highlighted in new right-influenced research, okay? Currently, problems like right now are like things like Islamophobia and immigration, okay? So they're quite buzzy topics at the moment where there's quite a lot of research being done around them. So what kinds of policies do our different perspectives favour? Well, firstly, we're going to look at functionalists, and they see society as based on a value consensus, and all the institutions in society should all work together to create more order and stability. It's part of the biological analogy, if you remember that. So social policies that are developed by government, okay, and influenced by sociological research should help society to run more smoothly. So educational policies should promote the ideal of meritocracy, which was an idea favoured by Durkheim and Parsons. And family policy should help them to carry out their functions more effectively. So, for example, the introduction of child benefit actually gave the families more economic stability so they could provide their economic function, okay? Functionists would argue that social policy should bring about gradual change, okay, so that it doesn't bring about any instability in society. So for them, social policy should be very much about gradual change. You could also note that the early positivists, like Comte and Durkheim, believed that research should actually bring about social change for the betterment of society, whereas current-day positivists are very much more about observing phenomena, measuring it, and objectively presenting it to government for them to make decisions about policies. So they've got a slightly different view from the early positivists. Unsurprisingly, Marxists see society as divided and in a state of conflict between the rich and the poor. Therefore, they believe that social policies only benefit the ruling class. So, for example, taxation. Okay, the average worker is taxed a fairly large proportion of their income, whereas corporation tax is something around about 4 or 5% on all profits made, which is significantly lower on the level of income tax. Even policies that appear to benefit the working class ultimately benefit the ruling class. So the NHS keeps the workers healthy for work and capitalism, and arguably benefits actually stop the poorest in our society uprising against the vast inequality in our society. Now, so for Marxists, they believe that sociologists should constantly try and reveal the exploitation in our system and call for change and reform. Feminists, similar to Marxists, recognise there is conflict in society, and for them, social policy is all about reinforcing patriarchy, benefiting men at the expense of women. So, for example, feminists argue that there is a familistic ideology, okay, that encouraged traditional families and having children. Things like benefits like child support and marriage tax breaks encourages people to conform to this family ideal. However, they are very critical of the family and argue it is very exploitative as a unit, both physically, emotionally, and financially on the women. Feminist research has had an impact on reducing gender stereotyping in schools by highlighting sexism in books. So there is some evidence of social policy being influenced by feminism. You've also got the Equal Pay Act. You've got changes in divorce law. That also is a bit of a victory for feminist policy change. The fact that you can have abortions now, you can use the contraceptive pill, which is free. These are all things that encourage more choice and give women more control. Okay. Radical feminists advocate separatism, however, and this can be seen in the establishment of women's refuges set up for women to escape domestic violence. So even radical feminism has an impact. Remember, it was Germaine Greer who said, to be free from patriarchy, women need to live in separate households. Unsurprisingly, the new right believed that the state should have only minimal involvement in society and people should take responsibility for their own lives. If you remember, Margaret Thatcher said that there is no such thing as society. People need to look after themselves and their own. If you're ill, your family should take care of you. So they are opposed to the provision of welfare support to families or in education or health, as this makes people dependent and creates more social problems. Charles Murray, in particular, was very critical of the welfare state, saying it created a culture of dependency amongst the underclass. So they would actually encourage policies that encourage people to be independent. They discourage divorce, and they have a zero-tolerance approach to crime, so you might want to link that with right realism. They believe in limiting child support, for example, because they believe this is encouraging lone parent families. Now, recently there's a report that's gone through, and I think they're going to increase the minimum wage to, I think it's £6.90 an hour. Now, the new right would be a fan of this because it means if more people are earning money at work, less likely they are to actually go on to benefits because it's the actual employers that are paying those wages and not the state. Postmodernists see today's society as being characterised by globalisation, diversity, risk and fragmentation. Therefore, social policies must take into account the effects of globalisation, global risks, and the reduced role of national politics. Okay? They are much more in favour of policies that recognise that we live in a global world. So, for example, the European policy of free movement across borders, they would be in favour of because they argue the nation state is no longer relevant. We are now in a global village, so to speak. In terms of the referendum on leaving the EU, they would see this as a step backwards in an increasingly global society. Postmodernists also claim that things such as class and gender and ethnicity are no longer relevant when constructing your identities. So policies based on these categories are no longer relevant. Okay, so they're critical of policies aimed at possibly eliminating gender inequality in the sense that they don't think gender is really a relevant issue anymore. And they believe the individual has much more control over their future. They would be critical of any social policies, okay, that claimed to be able to reform a particular social problem because they don't believe that there is one truth out there, okay? So sociological findings cannot actually provide a basis for policy making because there's no unified viewpoint out there. And here is an example of a 33-mark question that you could get on social policy in our society. It's quite a nice question, actually, because you guys know plenty of different social policies in crime, education, family, that would help to answer this question.